Hi, you've happened upon my channel, Growing Your Own Mind. YouTube requires that I ask you to subscribe, so please consider subscribing. And if you stick around to hear the story I'm about to tell you and decide afterwards that you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate your support. Actually, more than that, I need your support. Thanks. Today is Saturday, September 30th, 2023, and this is the first in a series of podcasts called Growing Your Own Mind. I'm NCR Davis. A long time ago, when I was in my 20s, I met a very old artist. Her name was Emma Lytle. She lived in the Mississippi Delta. I adored her. She was the wisest person I had ever met. At the time, I had just finished a Master of Arts in English. My emphasis had been modern poetry. Miss Emma had a marvelous swimming pool, and she told me that I could visit her anytime and swim. I was too intimidated to bother her too often, but every once in a while, I'd push myself to stop by for a swim. Afterwards, she'd offer me a Coke and a plate of warm cookies and an erudite conversation. I recall one day in which she asked me about my field of study. When I said it was poetry, she said, it doesn't matter from what century of poetry I read. I consider every poem to be mental furniture. I understood what she meant. It was such a wonderfully female statement. Many of us love to nest, right? We move furniture and furnishings around in our homes, constantly tweaking, adjusting, moving that sofa just a little to the left, right? Well, poetry, she meant, is just like that. A person can read a poem and maybe memorize a few lines and then later move those lines around a bit, shift them this way and that. They become mental furniture. Today, for this first podcast, allow me to tell you a story, and at the end of it, I'd like to ask you to move the story around in your head, like it's mental furniture. And if you have time, jot down your thoughts about the story and email them to me. The story comes from my novel entitled For the Boys, the war story of a combat nurse in Patton's Third Army. The book is being released today by Casemate Publishers. In this work, I created a narrative voice to retell some of the experiences that happened to a young woman, a nurse, who served in Patton's Third Army by caring for patients just behind the front lines. In a way, I suppose, I'm offering this podcast as one method for interacting with my readers, but also as a way to connect with listeners who don't often buy books. I want to listen to you, learn from you about what you think, how you live, what you struggle to understand. Why? Because I've grown tired of trying to get a pulse on people's thoughts. Ever since COVID, I've been feeling my way through major news networks and social media channels. They leave me disheartened, mostly because what I experience in daily life when I leave my writing spot and enter the community where I live, I don't see the same world as what's shown on major media channels and on social media. When I visit media sites, I know that I'm seeing only a sliver of reality. I feel as it were partially blind, as if I'm bumping about posts, looking for reflections of the kind of life I see when I go out into the world. That's why I'm building this podcast. I want to hear from you, and I plan to hear from you through my storytelling. Many people throughout my life have told me that my greatest gift is telling stories about real life occurrences. So I'm going to tell a story, a true one, on each weekly podcast. And after the story, I'm going to ask a few questions for you to respond to me with your insights. And in future podcasts, I'll share some of your thoughts and weave them into future real life stories. Today's story is one of those real life stories, but it happened many decades ago to that young nurse I referred to earlier, the one from my book. The nurse's name was Lieutenant Mary Bolster. The date of this story happened on December 20th, 1944. Now, to get the most out of this story, try to get yourself in a pensive state of mind for just a few minutes. Take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes if you can. Now, imagine snow-laden, frigid hills of winter in war-torn France, 1944. If you've ever seen the 1970s TV show MASH, or maybe the series Band of Brothers, you'll pretty much have an idea of this story's setting. During World War II, the Army Nurse Corps provided combat nursing units to care for the wounded and dying on the front lines of the European theater of war. Many don't know that females were camping just behind the front lines of battles. They lived on the ground in tents and bombed out buildings during one of the harshest winters on record in Europe. Lieutenant Mary Elizabeth Bolster was one of those nurses. On that night, December 20th, she reported for duty on the surgical ward that was just behind the walls of what was called the Heinrich Himmler Barracks. It was a compound that the Germans had occupied for about 4 years in France. Evacuation hospitals, of which Lieutenant Bolster was a member, followed the fighting troops as they made their way across Normandy, chasing the Germans back to the Rhineland during the summer, fall, and winter of 1944. On the night in question, Mary Bolster entered the surgical ward with a noticeable limp. Her right foot was so swollen that she couldn't wear the required nursing shoes and instead was compelled to wear what was called an overshoe on that foot without the nursing shoe underneath it. The charge nurse that night happened to be Mary's best friend, a woman 5 years her senior named Lieutenant Monica Ames. Everyone called her Mona. When she saw Mary limping toward her, Mona wasn't surprised. Mary had presented with this foot issue a few months before. The cause of her foot swelling was never determined. It wasn't an injury. It wasn't cellulitis. And the strangest thing was that it didn't cause pain to the touch. It was just so swollen that she couldn't feel to walk. The last time it had happened, Mary came down with the flu the following day. During this winter night, she was already feeling stuffy, had a terrific headache, she said, and figured that once again, somehow the edema or swelling in her foot was a strange symptom of another flu strain that she was possibly coming down with. It didn't matter, though. Nothing would keep her away from reporting to duty. There were boys to save. Indeed, her evacuation unit's admissions had been staggering. 400 admissions per night were the norm for the past several days. They were far understaffed to handle this kind of patient load, so there was no way that she would consider her own physical health, or lack thereof, as a factor. It was of no concern. And as much as Mona loved Mary, she agreed. They needed Mary too desperately to allow her a night back in nurses' quarters to rest. And there was something else, something that she knew would be very difficult for Mary to hear, but she had to tell her. Mona's tone was grave. It scared Mary. She felt faint, so she pulled up a little bench that one of the privates named Poncho had made for her out of scrap wood that he'd scavenged along the travails throughout Normandy. It was just a little stoop that Mary could perch on. He'd lovingly made it for her during the first time she suffered from the swollen foot and subsequent flu. Mona leaned toward Mary and put her hands on Mary's shoulders. Mona's eyes were a deep, warm blue, but when she teared, her eyes turned gray. Mary's heart raced. "Who died, Mona? Please just get it over with and tell me." The summer before, just after the 39th Evacuation Unit had arrived in Normandy, one of Mary's first patients was a 19-year-old who was admitted with pneumonia. He became Mary's special, a term they used when they assigned a nurse only one patient to care for because that patient was so critically ill. This 19-year-old Private First Class Redmond was gravely ill. It was touch and go with him for many days, but he made it. Everyone loved this young man, and really, he was one who just had such an incredible grace with his appreciation for the unit's care of him. Funny thing happened, though. When Private Redmond was well enough to go back to the fighting, he'd been sick so long they couldn't find his tank unit. So until his tank unit could be located, what was he to do? In his case, he served as a ward boy, which in today's hospitals, his duties would have been comparable to a nursing assistant's duties. He became Mary's right-hand man, so to speak, and they became close friends over more than a 2-month period. Finally, though, in the fall of 1944, the Army located Private Redmond's tank outfit, and he had to say goodbye to the 39th. Flash forward to the night of December 20th. Mona could barely utter Redmond's name to Mary, but before Mary had time to completely fall into a hole of despair, Mona quickly told her that Redmond was not dead, but he was critical. But this time, it wasn't pneumonia. He was suffering from tank burns that covered over 40% of his body, and he'd taken a bullet in the chest. The odds were against him, and they had just taken him back for surgery. Mary couldn't breathe. She heard Mona, but she felt like she was inside a swirling, bungled series of sounds that had to have been a bad dream. It just couldn't be true. How could God do this? How in the world could they all have worked so hard to bring Redmond back from that awful pneumonia, only to see him die from a German's bullet in a burning Sherman tank? Oh no, it couldn't be. It wasn't going to be, she told herself. There was no way God was going to allow Redmond to die. She'd find a way to help God save him. Mary wanted to know how she could help. What did Redmond need? Plasma? She bet he needed plasma. Mona confirmed that he did, but this was the problem. The supply room, where crates of medical supplies like plasma were stored, had been shelled. Most of the contents were rubble. Mona had already sent a nurse named Laura to sift through the rubble, but she had come back empty-handed. Mary didn't know Laura very well. She wasn't from the 39th evac. She was a nurse that the unit had borrowed from the Red Cross. The Army was known to borrow personnel when there was an overwhelming need for staff. Mary insisted that she go look for herself, but she wouldn't be able to reach the supply room without help. Her foot was not cooperating. So Mona ordered Laura to give Mary a hand, allow her to lean on her, help her get over to the supply room. After all, they were best friends. Mona knew that there was no arguing with Mary. She was going to find plasma for Redmond, come hell or high water. So the two young nurses made their way to supply. Okay, now that I've given you the context, I'll tell you the rest of the story by reading a passage from my book. "There," she remarked, then pointed to some bottles with her flashlight. Had Laura checked that crate? It looked undamaged. She said, yes, it was intact, but she'd checked the bottles in it already. They weren't the right ones. Then she said, Laura, the unthinkable, the illogical, the most absurd words that Mary ever heard. The bottles were marked colored, so they would be of no use. It was against Army regulation to give a white patient any plasma from a bottle that was labeled colored. Mary's skin seared. She made her way to the crate and leaned over it, directing the light to see the labels for herself. They did read colored. She ripped the labels off 4 of the bottles and shoved them into Laura's arms, told her to run back to the ward. She would take full responsibility for the decision, and they could court-martial her for all she cared. She screamed at her. Boys are just boys. They're not a color, for God's sake. You miserable, mindless, pathetic excuse for a... But Laura was gone. Mary didn't know how much Laura heard. She didn't care. And if the moron reported her for going against Army regulations, so be it. But if she didn't get that plasma to Redmond's surgeon in less than 2 minutes, she was dead anyway. Mary would kill her. Left alone, she bent back over the crate and tore off every label that displayed the word colored. Her back leaned against the side of the only wall of the supply room that was still standing, then slid against it until she reached the floor. Her mind floated into a daze. She became part of the debris that surrounded her, the glass shards, the bullet casings, the splintered wooden crates, all the used up and shattered muck. So, I'm hoping that you think about the story that I've just told you. Move it around in your head as if it's mental furniture. And then please email me. Tell me your thoughts, your memories. And then in a later podcast, I'll read some of your responses. If you don't want to share your name with me, but would like for me to include your thoughts, that's fine too. I'll respect your privacy. Write to me using the email that's highlighted in the show notes, or visit my website. It's called Grow Your Mind with NCRDavis.com. Grow Your Mind with NCRDavis.com. If you'd like to read my book, tap one of the links in the show notes to take you to your favorite place for buying books. Now, here's a glimpse into next Saturday's podcast. It's about something I witnessed on April 4th, 1968, when I was 5.5 years old. Even though I was that young, my memory of that evening has never left me. Until next week, I'm NCR Davis, and this has been a Grow in Your Own Mind podcast. Thank you for listening.